Hey, everybody. Welcome to the next session in Partner-Led Product Day. I'm really excited to talk with Brandon Foo, the CEO of Paragon. Paragon is the gold sponsor for today. So that's, first of all, thanks, Brandon, for joining us and partnering up with us on this event. Really excited to kind of dive into this. We're going to talk about integrations, creating a scalable integration strategy. So, I've seen, and I looked it up before and I couldn't find the exact one I was looking for, but I know I'm in the right ballpark here. So maybe somebody else has the stat from a recent survey. It was something like 70, 71%, huge percentage of buyers say that integrations are a very important factor in determining whether or not they're going to purchase a product. And this is something that we all know, just from our own experience, but buyers care more and more about integrations. In fact, I would argue, at least in my own case, there are times where I care more about the number and quality of integrations than I do about the product itself. Like maybe product A is a little better, product B is not as good, but it has better integrations. I'll go with that, right? So like buyers clearly care as much or more about integrations as products and features themselves. Do we see that same level of care and prioritization among product teams?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Isaac. And to start by answering that question, I'll maybe provide a little bit of background context as to why I think integrations are so important in today's market. So, as we all know, the SaaS ecosystem has grown exponentially in the past few years, and the average company today actually uses over 110 different SaaS applications. And so, gone are the days when you would buy, SAP or Oracle, and that was your CRM, that was your ERP, that was your HR solution. Companies are now using hundreds of different point solutions, and these companies' data lives across all of these different systems. I think that's really why it's become so important for really any B2B software company to be able to integrate with all the other tools that the modern company today uses, right? And you shared that stat with, 70% of buyers, are factoring integrations as one of the main reasons that they will choose a particular vendor. I even go beyond that to say that research has shown products with more integrations exhibit higher retention and a higher willingness to pay. So they can actually charge more with the more integrations that they have. So I think, there's absolutely an argument to be made that integrations are as important as the core product that you're selling itself. And if not in some ways, even more important, to your point, Isaac, even if the core products might be better vendor A than vendor B, if it doesn't support all the integrations you need, oftentimes that can be a blocker, that can be a deal breaker for many buyers. So I think, absolutely that a lot of people recognize that today, that integrations are important, but I think we're still in the early days of really, being able to execute on that as a part of core product strategy.
Yeah, one of the things that I look, there tends to be a lag in culture and incentives inside organizations. There's a lag from what the market is doing because those are institutions that are kind of built over time. You get sort of the inertia of organizational structure. So it seems like we're at a moment where even though we all kind of know that the market cares a lot about integrations, product teams, it's still kind of like when you think about the prestige, the rewards, the compensation, delivering products, delivering features is kind of what those teams are geared towards, where integrations are often kind of oh yeah, we also have to have those, right? We got to make sure we have the integrations our customers are begging for. Let's at least knock off the top 5 that they are demanding and just like get it done. Great. But now we're going back to the real work of developing our own product. How do you see, maybe you have examples of some teams that have done a better job at kind of internally aligning and incentivizing? How can you make integrations as big of a deal internally and even externally with marketing as a product? Like launching a new integration or even updating an integration to make it world class. How can that become as big a deal as launching a new product or a new feature?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right in terms of what we've seen and maybe the perception that integrations are not as sexy as the core product features, right? That your team's really excited to be building. But I think the important thing to hear is to look at it from an ROI perspective, right? And I think really, product teams, the hard thing to do is prioritization. And I think really the easy way to do that is, really looking at the ROI of, adding a new core product feature versus maybe expanding on your integrations. So like I said, we've seen research that products or customers that are using one integration have up to 15% higher retention and up to 30% higher willingness to pay, right? And that's from a customer using one integration for a product. So I would, encourage product teams to look at that ROI relative to, let's say, the ROI of building a new product feature. Maybe in practice, it's not that easy to actually determine what that ROI is, but I think over time, product teams can, develop the systems to measure, what is the impact that these integrations have on the customer's retention, on upsell rates, renewal rates, on ACV expansion, right? And I think through that process, it can become easier and perhaps more clear for product teams to prioritize integrations relative or perhaps even over core product features based on that ROI.
So we've been kind of cheating here so far in this conversation because we've been kind of talking about integrations in the plural as kind of a lump thing. Like, well, how do you prioritize integrations versus features? And aren't integrations great? When the rubber meets the road as a product team, let's say you care a lot about integrations and you do want to prioritize them. When it gets down into the granular, like picking which integrations, what are you going to focus on? There's so many. I know in my previous company, it was consumer facing, but we had this all the time. We'd be kind of going over our engineering priorities. And there's always these kind of nagging, like people want this integration or this integration, and there's 3 or 4 of them. Which one's going to move the needle? And which needle is it going to move? Is it going to move helping us get new users? Is it going to help us retain? How do you kind of go through that process of selecting? And maybe this gets to a question of like a few really core integrations versus a broader approach that says, okay, we have kind of good enough integrations with 10 or 20 things. What's that process like? Because that's not easy. That's not easy to make those determinations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that, early on, it comes from customer demand. I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience here have seen that their customers have asked for certain integrations. Maybe they've even lost deals to competitors due to not having specific integrations. And I think that is, obviously the best starting point to be able to determine which integrations that you should prioritize, at least for the first few core integrations that you might need to, capture the critical mass of demand that you're seeing in your market. I think beyond that, it can become a little bit more aligned with your longer term product vision, right? In terms of, beyond building the first 5 or 10 or 20 integrations, really as, to become a leader in your market where you envision your product going. And it could be, based on customer demand that you're seeing today, it could be that you envision new opportunities to unlock verticals where you might not be building those integrations today into a particular vertical, but expanding into those integrations might unlock a new market opportunity in a new vertical that's not being focused on currently. So I think a lot of it is both based on kind of a reactive approach to customer demand that your sales team or marketing team is probably seeing today, as well as taking the longer term approach in terms of your product vision and where you really see yourself going in the next 2-3 years in the market.
Yeah, it's interesting, thinking about the ways to measure that demand or measure what your customers value. And I imagine there's kind of a 2-prong approach, right? One is the kind of objective data, like, hey, let's look at, if you can use something like a reveal, for example, you could potentially you could see how many of your customers are also customers of these other products. And you may see a lot of overlaps. And that's kind of like objective data that you can pull up to determine where there might be might justify investment. But then there's also the quantitative thing, because I think of the analog in marketing where it's like attribution, where do these leads come from? And the attribution software is notoriously not that good, especially when it comes to things like, podcasting or social. And just an open-ended question, just asking customers like, hey, what 3 integrations would you love to see? Or which integrations would you, if we got to pick one in the next quarter, which integration would you want us to work on or to upgrade? And almost doing like sort of a more open-ended, like invitation. I'm really curious if, if that's a effective way to kind of gather some of that market intel about where to spend those resources. Have you seen any kind of innovative or out of the box ways to gauge the demand or the impact?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one way. I think another way is that, for certain companies, let's say, any sales enablement products will need to integrate with Salesforce, HubSpot, probably Dynamics and Pipedrive. And those are really table stakes integrations to unlock your market, right? If you're selling to any sales organization, you're going to need at least the top 4 or 5 CRM integrations. But I think from there, even if you might not have customers asking for it, there's obviously another 100 CRMs in the market. So you could potentially use that demand from the most common CRM integrations to then infer that if we expand to maybe the long tail of the next 20 or 30 CRMs as an example in this case, right, that could unlock a longer tail of maybe less less commonly requested integrations, but that are still distributed along a larger segment of the market that's maybe not using Salesforce or HubSpot. So that's something that we do ourselves, where we see, a large, concentration of demand in sales, CRM integrations, marketing automation integrations, and that usually signals to us that, hey, it makes sense for us to invest in maybe the longer tail of some of the less common integrations in the same category, in the same vertical, but that could unlock demand that we have, been able to infer that there's a validated demand for.
Yeah, I love that long tail point. I just did some writing about this, more in the case of agency partners and tapping the long tail there, but in the integration side, the tech partner side, it's just such a powerful thing. I come back to the sort of obvious analogy, the poster child for the long tail, which is YouTube. The ability to tap into all the millions of creators, some of which only have a few followers. If you can do that without incurring too much cost, the power of the discovery process there, because you don't necessarily know, like there could be a long tail, a smaller CRM that maybe you don't even know they're really big in one particular region, or they're going to be really big and they become, or maybe just their total size isn't huge, but because they don't have very many partner opportunities, the fact that you're going to create an integration, they will make a huge deal about that and they will do more for you than maybe one of the big boys would. And so sometimes that, like, the long tail as a process of widening the pool for creating more discovery, more ability to say, hey, look, this one integration over here, this actually has a lot going on in it. Maybe this warrants further investment. I just think that's something that's really missed. But how is that? How's that scalable? I mean, I'm not trying to throw you a softball here, but this basically gets to what you do and why you founded Paragon. Like, how can you, if you say, okay, we want to do more than just a couple big integrations, we really want to tap into the power of the long tail and go deeper down the, integration rabbit hole, I guess. How can an engineering product team do that effectively without just spreading themselves too thin?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this goes back to, your first question about our product teams treating integrations with the same importance, and value as core product features. And I think largely the answer today is still no. And it's understandable because I think the fact is, up until now, the cost of building integrations from an engineering resourcing perspective has been, a massive engineering lift. What we've seen on average is that it takes anywhere from 3 to 6 months to build a net new integration. That's just for one integration. And that's just for the developments. As the APIs for these integrations may constantly change, that really requires ongoing maintenance in perpetuity. And that's individually maintained for every single integration that you might build. So going back to maybe our sales enablement example, for a core integration like Salesforce or HubSpot, okay, it makes sense to invest 6 months in the maintenance to build and maintain those integrations ourselves. But to your point, that really makes it difficult to develop a scalable integration strategy for the long tail of maybe the next 10 or 20 integrations, where there's still market demand. The demand for each individual integration may be relatively smaller, but the aggregate of it might be 30 or 40% of the market that you're neglecting because you're not able to address these long tail of integrations. So that is, of course, part of our thesis at Paragon. For those who aren't familiar with Paragon, we provide an embedded integration platform that helps software companies integrate with the SaaS ecosystem. So essentially, we provide a single SDK that you can embed in your products and then integrate instantly with any SaaS integration. We support over 60 pre-built integrations, and you can also integrate with custom APIs as well. Not to turn this too much into a pitch, but in general, it's difficult to develop a scalable integration strategy by building fully in-house. And so, our vision is really to be able to provide a more productized solution, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every CRM integration that you want to add to your product, and that you can easily tap into what might be the next 10 or 20 integrations on your roadmap without needing to really invest the months and really years of engineering effort that it takes to build and maintain them.
Yeah, I want to, in a minute, I've got a question from the chat I want to take first, but in a minute, I want to get to just a little bit more of the difference between kind of traditional iPaaS. Hard to say traditional because it's pretty new, but traditional iPaaS versus the embedded iPaaS. But first, we have a great question from Jenna Ochoa, partner marketing at Dacity. She said, in your experience, how involved should tech partnerships be in product meetings?
Yeah, I think they should be very involved, and probably more involved than they are today. I think in general, we've seen that partnerships folks really understand the value of integrations, and partnerships in general, integrations just being one component of that. And I think that influence is maybe doesn't have as much impact on product and engineering decisions today as I think they should be. And I'm sure, many of the folks here think they should be. So I think that's, in terms of getting the buy-in from the executive leadership team and the product and engineering teams, I think, again, it goes back to sort of the ROI perspective of really aligning on, hey, what are the goals of the product team? Is it to increase the retention or the renewal rate of the product? For the engineering team, being able to really minimize the cost of ownership in developing and maintaining integrations. And I think really being able to bring that narrative to the broader leadership and product and engineering teams. I think that's an opportunity that partnership has to kind of bring that perspective. And I think one that should have a bigger seat at the table than maybe it does today.
Yeah, I feel like for partnerships people out there, if you really do your homework and you figure out what motivates the company that you're partnering with, like what are the metrics they look at? I'm reminded, when Jared was at PandaDoc, he said he figured out that HubSpot's number one metric they were focused on at that time was getting someone to close their first deal on HubSpot, because as soon as they did that, their retention was through the roof. Well, before they closed that first deal, they were much more likely to churn. And so they found with it wasn't even a real integration. It was like a hack that they put together that had people using PandaDoc had a much faster time to getting that first deal done. And so he was able to go to HubSpot and say, look, I have real data right here that says, here's your average. And then here's how much it goes up when people are using PandaDoc. This is why you should invest in this. And so I'm thinking of as a partnerships person, if you can bring some of that hard data and get in front of the, get your counterpart in the other organization excited and get them to get that in front of the product decision makers. And then it becomes a no-brainer, because then you're showing them that they're leaving money on the table. And if they're leaving money on the table, they have a motivation. But if you're just sort of like, hey, we like you, you like us, you should build this. It's like, well, that's true of a lot of people. So what, how are you going to make those calls? So getting any way to kind of get to that insight. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about if you can implement the analytics or the measurements to really determine what is the value of a customer that uses the HubSpot integration for PandaDoc, and you can quantify that in actual data that you can then bring to your leadership team, to your product and engineering teams. I think that's one very powerful way that partnerships and companies in general can really align on the value of integrations and why it should be prioritized alongside core product features and in general as a part of the company's strategy.
So this is not a sales pitch. This is what I'm genuinely curious about from you. I'm non-technical. So from my standpoint, I see the emergence of the Zapier type solutions. and this is like a phenomenal thing, a big breakthrough. If you're, you're looking at your product and you're looking at integrations, when do you say, hey, look, we don't need to build all these. We've got Zapier out there. Customers can hook it up themselves. It's pretty easy. When is that not enough? Like, when should you make the call to go deeper and say, okay, we actually have to build something here, that's a native integration, or it's an embedded iPaaS. It's sort of a level up in terms of the customization. Like, where is that decision made? Do you see people or customers falling off, not integrating because they don't want to go through setting up Zapier, or it's just not doing enough? It's not robust enough. Like, how do you think about that trade-off? Like, when would you tell somebody Zapier is not enough, you need to be using Paragon, in other words?
Yeah, so traditional iPaaS, or what we'll call traditional iPaaS in general, most people know as Zapier in the past, or more legacy providers like MuleSoft, is first of all fundamentally designed for a different use case, right? It's really designed for connecting internal applications, and so the real difference with using Zapier for your customers' integrations is that, first of all, your customers need to each individually own their own Zapier accounts. And they also need to configure the workflows or the Zaps that connect their product to yours. And so not only does that result in a user experience that takes your customers out of the product that you provide, it also creates a room for error. They could misconfigure the integrations if they're not technical people. But another important thing to consider is that also requires each of your customers to individually pay for their own Zapier account, which could be hundreds of dollars a month. And we've seen a lot of folks start with that. And it is, one way that you can start tapping into the value of integrations. And a lot of customers have come to Paragon starting from that Zapier approach, realizing that it's not scalable. One, because your customers need to each individually configure their own Zapier integrations. But they're also losing a lot of potential value that they could be capturing, because your customers are now giving $100 or $200 a month to Zapier, which, if you are able to provide those integrations natively as a part of your product, you could be increasing the ACVs that you're capturing from these customers. And so we've seen that a lot of customers, starting with that Zapier-based approach, wants to move to a more native integration solution, because they can provide a better product experience that's built in natively into their product, into their application. It provides a better user experience because your customers don't have to go figure out how to create their own Zaps, set up their integrations, right? It's a one-click, essentially integration experience. But we've also seen that a lot of customers and companies in general, not just using Paragon, are able to just charge a lot more. And usually the integrations are segmented to the higher tiers, the enterprise tiers, and they're really able to capture that value from providing those integrations natively, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to with something like Zapier.
By the way, just yesterday, Jared scolded me when I said Zapier. He's like, it's Zapier. Zapier makes you happier. And then I said it again. So I already forgot. Great comment here from Brian, just in terms of breaking down some of the quantitative things you can bring to your, to the discussion. Deals that were lost due to not having an integration, support tickets / CSM notes with requests for an integration, segment users with Mixpanel / heap based on integration usage to track adoption and churn, and competitors' catalogs. All some really, really good nuts and bolts suggestions for making that case. So, in our last 5 minutes or so here, I'm curious, do you think of integrations? I know it's both. I know the answer is both, but I'm curious, like, is this an offensive play or a defensive play? Because I tend to see, it feels like a lot of companies think of integrations purely as defense. Like, okay, if we don't have them, we'll end up losing, customers to people who do. We kind of have to have them. I don't see a lot of companies really going on the offense with them and saying, we're going out of our way to aggressively scope and build the best integrations, to market those, to make a big deal about it. Like we opened up with, treating it like a product. I'm reminded of when Drift launched their integration with Marketo, and they gave it a name. They treated it like a product launch, conversational ABM. I don't see a lot of companies kind of playing offense with this. Do you think that that's going to sort of shift, that it's like, look, it's not enough to just use it as a defensive strategy to not lose customers who are getting grumpy? Do you see more companies going out there and saying, like, leading with that, saying this is the value prop? We're always going to have the best integrations, and we're going to have them first and fastest. And don't worry, when new stuff comes on the market, we'll add it to the integrations. Do you see that trend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it will and it should shift in that direction. I think earlier on in a company's trajectory, it will be more defensive, where let's say sales enablement companies, right? It's going to be table stakes to have CRM integrations, Salesforce, HubSpot. I think earlier on in that journey, it's going to be more defensive, and you're going to lose deals, right, outright, if you're not going to be able to support those table stakes integrations. So I think that's where it starts off. But I think as companies mature and as their integration strategy begins to scale, they're supporting already maybe the core, table stakes integrations that their customers want. I think from there they can start to take a more offensive, we can say, approach to integrations, right? Where you can, like I mentioned earlier, maybe more proactively go after new markets with new segments of integrations tailored to a specific vertical, and you can proactively target that vertical ahead of your competitors, right? And that's where you can really take a more offensive approach. And I think, more broadly, as companies begin to scale, integrations can become a very core part of their product strategy and their product vision. You mentioned, Drift is one really good example where they have, essentially branded, some of their integrations as a core product feature. I think at scale, where we see companies like Salesforce, obviously, but even Slack has done an incredible job of this in the last 5 years, really using integrations as a moat, where they can create an incredibly defensible strategy, where they have a partnership ecosystem of thousands of different integrations and partner integrations, where no one can go after Slack right now because they have such a powerful ecosystem of integrations and partners. So I think, earlier on, it may be taking more of a defensive approach and getting to that point where you're at parity. And then I think from there, if you have the opportunity to, you can be a lot more proactive and perhaps aggressive about getting ahead of competitors and really building that lead in the market based on a scalable integration strategy.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I kind of see this trend starting to bubble up with newer companies from day one, instead of saying, okay, phase one, the crawl, walk, run, we'll just start with, here you go, use Zapier, use Workato, whatever. From day one, they're looking at something more like an embedded iPaaS, something that's more natively integrated, and saying, hey, we've got to be able to do this starting now, looking into the big vision, and to come out the gate with sort of a higher level of development and in-depth integrations here. Brandon, this is absolutely awesome. I feel like I could go for another hour just asking you more about this, because I think there's just such an interesting ecosystem unfolding, or just a different way that products are developed and thought about. Not as like, here's our solution, but like, here's our node among all these other nodes that are connected. And those connections are just as important as the nodes themselves. So everybody check out the dedicated room. We're going to have a dedicated rooms tour, I think, shortly today, but check out the dedicated room for Paragon. They're going to be hanging out in there. They've got a table in there. Keep the conversation going. Everything you wanted to know about iPaaS, embedded iPaaS, that's where you go to get that conversation. Brandon, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Thanks everyone for watching.
See you at the next session.
All right.